Hello and welcome to episode 1 of A is for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. I'm talking to Professor Richard Williams about his recent book, Reyner Banham Revisited, published this year by Reaction Books.
In Banham, the encounter with the everyday is incredibly important, and I think you're right to pull that out. I mean, it's a thing which really drew me to him. There was this idea of wanting to account for the world as it actually is somehow, looking at the built environment as something complex and multidimensional and multi-authored.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello, Richard. Thanks for being here today. We're going to talk about your book, Reyner Banham Revisited, which unfortunately for me has already been stained by children. Anyway, it's a really great book. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Right. Yeah. I'm Richard Williams. I'm the professor of contemporary visual cultures at the University of Edinburgh, and I've been here a long time. I've been in the University of Edinburgh for about 20 years now, and I have been for most of that time. I've worked on architectural themes, but I've sort of worked in a way that's not unlike Banham. I've worked on the edges of architecture, and I've been interested in it as a category. But I'm not an architect, so I originally trained as an artist at Goldsmiths in the 1980s. And then later as an art historian, and then I kind of came to architecture really through doing the research that I did for a PhD. But I'm not an architect, so I'm approaching the whole category and whole problem of architecture as something of an outsider. So that's me, and I've written quite widely about the architecture and visual culture of the 1960s. So I think the 60s are probably my comfort zone, where I'm happiest. But I've thought about the questions around, I suppose, architectural modernism in different geographical locations, and Brazil was an interest for a period of time. And the US has always been interesting.
Did you spend time in Brazil?
Yeah. I mean, I never lived in Brazil, but there was a period that I visited a lot, and I have been a lot over the years. And I think the reason for going, post hoc rationalization. It was I wanted to visit a place. Having done a lot of work on in the Anglo-American context, I wanted to visit a place that hadn't been through the same convulsions or ideological convulsions as the Anglo-American world had done around modernism, or at least I thought it was different. And I was simply curious, and I did become, over the years, I've become very interested in certain aspects of it, and Sao Paulo in particular is a city that really got my
that had sort of encountered or developed a modernism that was separate from the sort of Western Hemisphere's version of modernism. I'm thinking here of there's a very interesting book by a woman called Jennifer Robinson called Ordinary Cities, which is about the idea of a kind of everyday modernism.
Yeah.
That modernism is not so much a thing, but a mode of encounter with reality, I suppose.
Yeah, I know of that book. I don't know it. I don't know it to read, but yeah, that sort of thing was interesting to me, and I think also one of the starting points was I wanted to see Brasilia. To just
what's it like? Is it good?
Yeah, well, it was great. I mean, so this is, I mean, we're now going back literally 20 years at a point which was, you know, it's really pre-internet. I mean, well, at least, you know, mass adoption of the internet. So at that point, it was almost impossible to get, easily images of what the place looked like now. You know, I mean, it sounds bizarre. You know, I mean, it's not that long ago, but so a lot of the motivation was just to see what it looks like, or what it looked like. And so I did go. I did take a lot of 35mm slides then, you know, now useless really. And I have been back a lot since then, and it's I mean, I suppose, you know, well, there are a number of things that were impressive about it to me, but you know, one was the fact that the pilot plan of the city, this central core, which, you know, everybody assumes is the whole city, you know, of course is only now a fragment of a much larger, much more complex metropolitan region with a, you know, population of, I mean, now, last time I was there, it was, you know, around about 4 million people.
Oh, right.
Really quite sophisticated infrastructure and, you know, enormous sense of scale and possibility and development. And I mean,
and retains that kind of does it derive its kind of spatial infrastructural organizational logic from that core, from that Nehemiah core, that original core? Or has it sort of expanded in the way that American cities expand, a kind of splurge across the landscape?
It's really the second. So so you've got this strange core which you know, has this plan which is preserved you know, partly by a UNESCO World Heritage Order, and then the way that development has been done is, you know, really has very little relation to what happens everywhere else. So it's I mean, it's fascinating from that context. I mean, hey, having said that, I mean, there are what you do see in the core is quite a lot of development now, which is, it's not you know, has pushed the boundaries of that plan, and it's, you know, it's denser than you might imagine. And there's a sense in which the boundary between the centre and the periphery is a bit more porous now than it was. But I mean, the plan is absolutely legible and you know, clear and well preserved. Fascinating.
That's really interesting. I mean, you've got these fantastic pictures of Cumbernauld. Cumbernauld I know well, and it strikes me like the way that you wrote about that in the book, and the way that kind of modernism is deconstructed in the later part of the 20th century seems to have certain parallels. And it's, I suppose, to go into Banham, this idea. So I was thinking about what would be my hypothesis about Banham from your book and from looking at his other works. And there's this idea of an architecture of the everyday, which seems to be, to me, central to the modernist story. A kind of encounter with reality rather than an encounter with abstraction. Is Banham trying to wrestle with this idea of the everyday, or is he doing something more esoteric?
No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, there are different versions of modernism, aren't there? So there are modernisms which are really, you know, highly abstracted and otherworldly and ethereal and whatever, and actually, you know, to some extent, the Brazilian modernism of Nehemiah is one of those things, you know. But yeah, certainly that there is in Banham, the encounter with the everyday is incredibly important, and I think, you know, you're right to pull that out. I mean, it's a thing which really drew me to him. There was this idea of wanting to account for the world as it actually is somehow, looking at the built environment as something, you know, complex and multidimensional and multi-authored. So one of the things that he does that's, I think, most compelling for me is that he's interested in the built environment as used, built environment actually inhabited, and the ways that it might depart from a plan. So I mean, he never went to Brazil, but I mean that precisely that disjunction between the centre and periphery that you get in Brasilia, and the ways that the centre, historic centre, has been adjusted over the years. I mean, it's precisely those sorts of things that are appealing for him. What sort of make Banham an interesting critic, and somebody who's worth returning to, I think. So yes, absolutely, the everyday. I mean, there's lots of different dimensions of that we could talk about. So.
Yeah. I was, one of the things that you mentioned early on, I suppose, that the issue of modernism and modernity remains up in the air. And I think when people think about modern architecture, they think of, what do they think of? If they're architects, they think of Mies and Corbusier and Alvar Aalto and people like that. But modernism, means something other than that, doesn't it? It means, well, there's that kind of saw, isn't there? That modernity is the change from animate to inanimate sources of power, to define modernity kind of simply. And is that what we see in modern architecture? Is that what modern architecture is doing? Is it reflecting simply on that technological shift? Or does it go beyond that? Because obviously modernism, as this kind of almost classical form of architecture, and I think you talk about that early on in the book, that the high modernism of the early period has its roots in, and in fact he talks about it. Banham talks about it in the book. Which one is it? Not Theory and the Design of the Machine Age. It's Age of the Masters. This one.
Which I don't talk about, but theory and design. He does talk about that in Theory and Design in the First Machine Age. So it's like what he's trying to do there is to recover the sense that the architectural modernism has its roots in technology and technological change, and that somehow it's forgotten that. And so he wants to re-establish that idea. And
it also has a civic quality that is comparable to the classical tradition. That the great buildings of modernism are legible as they sit within the canon of classical architecture. Am I right in thinking that, or does he reject that idea? Because this idea, because what I'm interested in is how he shifts from talking about people like Auguste Perret, towards thinking about architecture as process, which seems to be what he does. Are they in any way? Is there a continuity there? Does he understand it as a continuity?
Yes, I don't know whether I can answer that question exactly. I mean, I think the question of architecture and civic life. I mean, I think that's something that he gets interested in later on. So it's really, I mean, for me, there's a sort of quite a marked shift from thinking about architecture as image and to thinking about environment, and that really happened in the late 60s, and it's really from the architecture of the well-tempered environment onwards that he starts to think about questions that might include the civic life of architecture and the use and inhabitation and those things. And that for me is much more a sort of later part of the career. I mean, in Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, I mean, with that, there is some imagination of how buildings might be used or inhabited, or what the city might be like. But it's not it's not a huge part of that work. I think there's not a sense of him, as you get in a lot of the later work, a sense of him sort of being in a place and really inhabiting it and thinking about the life of the place. I mean, that's something that develops later on, I think.
So his conception of what architecture is seems to shift, doesn't it, from something that is, I suppose, artifact-based, thing-based.
Yeah.
And that does seem to be a radical shift that he moves through, which I found really interesting. Yeah. It's the sort of permanent question at the core of architecture, isn't it? Like, what is architecture? Like, is a bus stop architecture, or is it only cathedrals and things that pertain to? And I think that, I don't know if it was Gavin Stamp, it was someone of that ilk who said architecture is the sort of the coming together of the human desire to ascend and the knowledge of gravity.
Yeah.
And like and like, if it's not doing that, then it's not architecture. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I mean, in that there's definitely this shift from things to environment, and the beginning. I mean, some of the early writings about architecture, very much concerned with objects. So I was just looking again at the brutalism, the manifesto on brutalism, where he says three things which are, all very materialistic in a way. So it's about image, it's about the structure, it's about materials as found, and there's a clear sense in that of buildings as objects. And for me, it's in the shift is most clearly represented in the object of the car, actually, and how his attitude to cars changes over time. I mean, I've always, perhaps more interested in this question than anything, because they seem to. It's kind of long-lasting obsession that's got different dimensions to it, and they seem to pose different questions at different times. So, I mean, he starts out thinking about cars as designed objects, and this is before he can drive. So in the 50s, thinking about that Cadillac Eldorado. It's really extraordinary piece of design.
Giant bonnet. I like your description of the bonnet being sort of twice the size of the engine.
I mean, no, it's an extraordinary, mad piece of work, and he's quite right to try and explore it. But at that point, he can only appreciate it as an image, as something that you would just glimpse on the street and try and make and stuff like that. And then there's a very marked thing that happens with his writings on driving, where 66, I think it is, he learns to drive, and then all of a sudden, he's thinking about this is thinking about cars is not as designed objects, but as things that allow you to inhabit the world in a new way. And there is, going back to this question of civic life, there's some very acute reflections on that, civic life in relation to cars that appears in various bits of journalism. So, can roads be public space? What happens to you as a human being once you learn to drive? Do you inhabit society in a different way? Do people regard you differently as a driver or a non-driver or whatever? You really start to think about these questions, and he's sort of aware that historically, for whatever reason, the social circles that architects move in, they're often rather suspicious of cars and popular culture and things of that nature, and learning to drive, becoming a driver might put you in a different place in relation to architecture. And so there's something interesting that happens there.
Around. I mean, it's particularly interesting. I mean, obviously, Los Angeles is a city I have only touched down in. My wife is from California, and so I should have been to Los Angeles more, but I've been once for about 4 seconds. For about a quarter of a day, and it was incredibly smoggy. And compared with Northern California, where I'd just been up in the redwood forests and sort of having a oneness with the giant redwoods up there, wasn't quite my cup of tea at the time. But this idea of the car as an object of desire, and very beautiful. I learned to drive quite late, and have found it a hugely wonderful thing. I really enjoy driving, even quite long distances. Although urban driving is the most fun thing, but this idea of the way that the car transforms things is, as you say, really central, as I understand it, to his. To the production of a new civic space. I mean, if you think about LA and its gridlocked motorways now, they're all listening to the radio. And the Breakfast Club, the big hip hop radio show in Los Angeles, has 8 million listeners of a Breakfast Club morning, or something along those lines. And so all of a sudden that new network, that new kind of infrastructural network, incorporates people into a new sort of civility, which is perhaps just as civilized, or perhaps just as real as the ones that are sort of fetishized by architects in the way that, in the kind of classical way of townscape and.
I mean that's exactly the argument. You put it very well that it's this question. Could a landscape like this counterintuitively have its own civic life and of a sophisticated order and whatever, and it's posed there as a question, but it's worth thinking about. I mean for me it's worth thinking about these things now, given that kind of landscape is at the moment, changing very fast, and Los Angeles in particular is densifying, and really is quite a dense place, one of the densest cities in the US, and then that whole idea of a landscape orientated around the private car. Well, that 30 years into the future is going to be very different, no question about it. But it's interesting for me to look at these things and as they're disappearing or changing, and they're questions that are worth asking, because that it's like looking at something that's just there in plain sight, but somehow it escapes a lot of architectural discourse or
but it really does, doesn't it? And it's a very strange. I mean, it's one of these things that I get a lot from your book, the way you've written about it, is that Banham is very uncomfortable eventually with, not perhaps even eventually, perhaps from the very beginning, very uncomfortable with this idea of architecture as this esoteric and self-electing discipline.
Yeah, he's literally uncomfortable with that. There's an edginess about it, and he's got in some ways in retrospect it looks like a very central position in relation to it, but then he's also marginal. And there's a picture early on in the book. It's not to be honest, it's not exactly the picture I wanted. It's from the same sequence, but it's Banham with John Summerson and Pevsner. And he's the picture that I would have reproduced if it was easy to get is from the RIBA journal, and it's just for a couple of seconds before, and he really looks uncomfortable in that context, and he's sort of there looking on. He looks like like he's on the edge of it, although he has actually just given a talk. I mean, what pictures are pictures, but there is something about that. He's almost like he's caught off guard, and there's something revelatory about it. And then he, all right the way through the career, he's trying to work out where he is in relation to architecture. Sometimes he's just chucking grenades at it and trying to wind people up. And that last essay is a bit like that. The black box, the secret profession of architecture. But sometimes he clearly wants to be in it, and I think I know from the family that he was really delighted to get that chair of architectural history at NYU right at the end of his life. The thing that he never gets to take up, but he was really really pleased to be accepted somehow by kind of establishment. But it's an odd career in a way. It makes it more interesting career, because the question of what architecture is and where he is in relation to it, what's his contribution to it, that it's a very live and unresolved question all the way through. So he's constantly probing what it might be, and constantly asking questions about does architecture look at the right stuff? Is actually the built environment mostly not dealt with by architecture?
Well, I think that was something. So when he talked about Los Angeles and in his wonderful film, which I watched with my wife, because she misses California quite a lot, and she's fond of LA, and it feels like California. He's made a really good job of that. But he talks about the way that the car, for example, or the infrastructure of the car, the roads and the highways, they divide up the city and create these pockets of opportunity. And then he seems to take that, and this is where I think you, as a material culture kind of expert, possibly, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but he then uses that kind of way of thinking about space to incorporate the desert, for example, the Mojave, into the urban. So everything can become aestheticized in a way. Everything has artistic intent.
Absolutely. Well, he certainly, one thing he does with that, with the Deserts book, is urbanize it. Urbanize the desert. So, conceptually, he urbanizes it, and basically writes about the desert as a human product as much as anything else. It's a sort of natural phenomenon that's only really usable or apprehensible once people have got there and put in certain kinds of infrastructures that make it visible. I think the desert book, one of the things I did in my book actually was to try and make the desert book a bit more visible, because I think it does something really interesting. And it's definitely an outgrowth of the Los Angeles book. And clearly, we've been thinking about it ever since then. And it's it's a really interesting piece of work. But it's certainly a case of turning the desert into a human product as well.
And that's the sense I get of the man himself, is that he's extremely fond of humans. And so that humans perceive, it seems to me, to try and understand how the world itself is in a way a product of and for humans. And that's perhaps the awkward thing about him. So he embraces cars, which are obviously not cool anymore, because they are a means of encounter with the world, with our world, for humans, everybody, which I think is really elegant, and I think is a really joyful kind of position.
But it's a difficult position to hold now. I mean, I think you're right in identifying something uncomfortable about that, because it's there's in the areas that we work in, then there's a lot of discussion now about post-human, or thinking about the world as where the place of humans is downplayed or made less central. And that's not. I mean, I know a little bit about those literatures, but not a huge amount. But clearly, yeah, Banham is coming from somewhere else altogether, and it's a position that is not exactly. It would be a very unfashionable position.
But doesn't it relate back to his? So you use this word libidinal in the book.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Which I quite like, because it's about bodies, and it's got that kind of Henri Lefebvre idea of the sensory, sensual, and the sexual that he talks about, necessary and required within architecture if it's to become better. And then there's this quality, his encounter with modernism, and particularly the masters. And from what you were saying about Brasilia, when you encounter these great pieces of modernist architecture, they are undeniable as great pieces of architecture. It's like, as much you can take all the politics and kind of agendas you like, but when you encounter, I don't know, St. Bride's East Kilbride by Gillespie, Kidd and Coyer, it's an undeniable experience. Or Trellick Tower, or Robin Hood Gardens, and I really like that, and that aesthetic quality seems that he adopts. So you talk about this idea of New Brutalism as about the memorability of the image. This kind of aesthetic thing seems to me to be tied into this kind of what is it? This generosity towards everyday experience. Yeah, towards ordinary people.
Yeah. No, there's definitely a generosity there that's important.
Which I worry is not there in contemporary discussions about the future of the city, for example, where we talk about getting rid of cars, or we talk about a kind of imposing a kind of, dare I say it, bourgeois idea of what urban life should be.
No, I mean that's very very marked in contemporary urban discourse. I mean, and down to things like the 15-minute city. Think of a very contemporary example, but there's a lot of thinking that it is Banham would have found very troubling. I think. I mean, I think that's why for me he's still an interesting thinker. That he's and he's very alert to I suppose everyday kinds of experience that might be quite aesthetically rich, or quite profound, or bodily sort of moving in some way. He's alert to things which are often just hidden in plain sight, but which we choose to ignore because they don't fit into some scheme of how we think things ought to be. So, I mean, I suppose it's that, as in architecture, or, us as academics, I mean, we often think about how things ought to be rather than how they actually are. Yeah. And it's the richness of those actually are experiences that is what comes through Banham's work. A lot of the time, and now it's it's a good remains a kind of good critical way of thinking about the world. Even if the vehicles for doing that thinking, like cars, are problematical or troubling in themselves, for sorts of reasons that subsequently become apparent. But I mean, there are still. It's like an attitude to the world, and a set of ways of thinking that are very good at asking questions about how we think things ought to be.
There's also, I mean, he's very non-judgmental, isn't he? Mm-hmm. There's not a sense of judgment about things. So when he goes down to Venice Beach and he sees the muscle men doing their exercises in the 1970s, which is just awesome.
It is. That's quite funny. There's one thing. I mean, there is about that. I mean, I think there are various things that he kind of misses about LA, or at least didn't really report. But I mean, it's now. You go down there, and there's a very kind of queer aspect to Venice and that part of LA, which he seems to. I don't know whether you could talk about it in 72 or whatever, but there's a slightly sort of naive quality about the way that he reports it. But it's the basic generosity and sort of openness to things is always refreshing. Although, of course, he's not like that in relation to architecture, I suppose. Like, he is much more judgmental when it comes to thinking about the RIBA or the institution of architecture. I mean, that's where he's got a...
The film, thinking about this idea of the connection of Los Angeles, for example, to the desert, and therefore the desert having an urban character, or its identity being really governed by the urban core.
Yeah.
The Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, when Romeo gets in trouble in Venice Beach, he goes to the desert. The desert is the space. It's almost like the sanctuary within the city that is without the city. It's a really interesting idea. So clearly Baz Luhrmann had studied Reyner Banham.
Well, I don't know. I think it's a long-standing idea, isn't it? And the Mojave being this urban playground is something with a long history. Going right back to the 19th century, a place that is. I think as soon as the railroad goes through it.
But his idea of the everyday. So obviously, this idea of the generous encounter with reality, the non-judgmental, partly is at the heart of his American infatuation. Is that right? Why does he like Americana and America so much? I mean, other than being I come from near Norfolk. I come from the Norfolk border, so I understand what wanting to get out of Dodge feels like, I can tell you. But in fact, the first trip abroad I did, the first time I went on an airplane, was to America, because it was kind of felt like, if you could try to get out of North Fens, you really want to get out properly and never come back. And I never did. But what is this about America particularly? Do you feel that is?
Well, I mean, it's a broad, cultural phenomenon in part, isn't it? I mean, there is a early 50s, or after the Second World War, widespread fascination with American culture. I mean, America is, at the broadest possible level, it's producing an enormous amount of new visual culture, which is fascinating for lots of people, for all sorts of reasons. And I think, Banham had encountered it a bit in the war. He had encountered American service personnel in Norfolk, and I think had been rather fascinated by them, but it's very difficult to recover too much about his early life. I mean, clearly, he had met Americans, he'd seen them in Norfolk and been impressed in some way. But I think it's really, in a more structural way, it's around the independent group. So the group that meets informally around the ICA in the early 50s, where he encounters a bunch of people who are seriously interested in emerging American visual culture. So it's artists like Eduardo Paolozzi, Richard Hamilton, the Smithsons, Peter and Alison Smithson, part of that. A bunch of other people, all of them very interested in advertising, cars, television, film, and the just this massive proliferation of visual culture. And I think it broadly, it's this this place that's producing this stuff that exceeds anything that can be done at home, and it's fascinating for its profusion, and the fact that it breaks the rules, that it cuts through questions of class and social status that are, clearly are a big thing for.
And it's hyperabundance as well, isn't it? There was, the American military bases must have been, again, thinking about this idea of the networks, American military expansionism. And it happened just south of Margate. Margate, as a seaside town, had a military base just south of here, and a lot of the money from the GIs would wash up into Margate. And Margate, in its heyday post-war, and it really was quite a heyday, really fed off that. But there's this idea again, I suppose, that he feeds into this kind of network. The international group, they feed into this idea of a network of information that begins flowing across the globe, and they buy into that, and then retranslate it in Britain, which is really a really fascinating idea. And then that, off the back of that, developing this idea of an integrated, almost like a globalized world. It's like an idea of globalization of art, which I think is fascinating. But he doesn't like postmodernism in architecture. Am I right in thinking that?
No, that's right. Yeah. I mean,
even though that's really hybrid, even though that's really about the image and really aesthetically orientated.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's a strange thing that, I mean, I didn't say as much about that in the book as I could have done. I mean, partly because Nigel Whiteley had done that at some length in his book, so that was 20 plus years ago. But yeah, he doesn't like postmodernism, and I mean, in some ways he should, because it's there are aspects of it that are hybrid and generous and open to different different levels of culture. But no, he takes against it, and
is that because he thinks it's glib? Does he think it's sort of unserious and slightly ironic, and he isn't being ironic?
Yeah, I think at a certain level, I mean, he's a committed modernist, so this is he's still in a core way a true believer. So postmodernism, at least as articulated by James, is all about surface and image and all of that sort of thing. And there's something fundamentally unserious about it. But there's a contradiction, of course, because all of what he says about Los Angeles in 71 and 72, it's all about surface and sort of being accepting of that. So I think in different hands, then postmodernism might have got a better or a different reception. But I think it's partly also he hadn't been part of its formulation. He wasn't writing the manifesto. He wasn't doing what his pupil James did. So there's a slightly Oedipal thing going on there, I think, as well. I mean,
yeah, I do wonder about that, and I'm no psychologist, but there is your description of his early experience in the Bristol factory.
Yeah.
See, I mean, if I were a shrink, I would guess that this experience, particularly the traumatic component, and it must have been appalling.
Yeah.
Becomes, America comes in and saves us in the war. And the GIs come in and economically save us in our rural communities. And just trying to kind of clear his mind of this. So you've got this kind of top-down culture which precipitates this appalling violence.
Yeah.
And so he goes to the roots and elevates that as almost as an offering.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how, what kinds of connections you can make there, but certainly, I mean, the war experience is pretty appalling. I mean, what he's describing. I mean, everybody's experience were, well, there were so many appalling experiences, but he had a particularly difficult one, and basically what would now be called a breakdown, I think, at the end of it. So,
is there any sense that he tried to get to the heart of it? I mean, I think you suggest in the book that he didn't really talk about it much.
No, he didn't really, and there's not many accounts of it. But the account that I have of it is from Mary Banham, and it's there in an interview that she did with a family member who was just collecting material, and there's not a huge amount said about it, but he was hospitalised briefly, and then brought back to Norwich. So then the reinvention happens after that.
So there's this kind of sense of this reactionariness. Now, when I first read your book, and then I wrote down wrote down 3 words: war, machines, and death. That was my my immediate response. And then I wrote libidinal. So I thought, so war, machines, death, and libidinal. And I thought, that's probably not enough. That's not a fair critique of it. But I do wonder about that whole quality of that. For example, the New Brutus. So you've got the Smithsons and the lovely photographs that you reproduce in the book of the Hunstanton bathrooms, really refined, like really stripped back, almost. You can see kind of East Asian, Japanese kind of influences. You can see the kind of absolute barrenness, and there's a kind of reaction against the. It's really difficult to place how the New Brutalists and how he sits within the, you've got American pop culture, which he loves. You've got a rejection of the kind of superficiality of the empire styles, perhaps you might describe it, the stuff that produced the First and Second World Wars. And then you've got this really stripped back thing. And it all seems to kind of sort of make sense, all stick together, but it's difficult to track a pathway through it, isn't it? And to see where he sits in it.
Well, I mean, what you noticing, I suppose, is the fact that there are lots of different things going on, and they don't necessarily all fit together. That there's a lot of dressing up. I mean, or trying on different hats, and there are things which sort of grab his attention at different times, and they're sometimes contradictory. So that for example, the interest in surfaces, which doesn't then translate into a later support for postmodernism. And then there are things about brutalism which are somehow hard to square with the interest in popular culture, or at least you wouldn't, if you're coming at this material cold, you wouldn't think to make that connection. But he does sometimes try to do that with. I'm trying to think. There were various things I was thinking of, and now I've lost my.
I was just thinking. I mean, it makes sense to me. He sort of allows modernism to be what it is in its realization, rather than in. I suppose going back to what you were saying about Summerson and Pevsner, who have this kind of very discreet and very refined idea of history and historiography and artifacts in relation to that.
Yeah.
And he kind of just breaks it apart and says it is what it is. And it is what it does, more to the point. Which would come back to this idea of the New Brutalist idea of process. Architecture, modern architecture is what it does, not is what,
Yeah. I mean that's right. I mean he's very interested in how these things actually are in the world. So the encounter with buildings in the world is really important, and he can allow that. He can accept that they can become part of the story. And I suppose in terms of quality. when he's making judgments about things, the best buildings are the ones which where there's a sort of seamlessness between the concept and the lived experience. That they're able to be in the world in a way that doesn't necessarily contradict their design.
Yeah, and that includes.
Yeah, or I was going to say, but then sometimes he just likes stuff and just says, this is a great building because I say it's a great building.
Yeah.
But the experience is very important.
Yeah, the experience and that idea of its function relates also to its aesthetic appeal, but it's also presentation of the world beyond it. And I think that's what so for example, his interest in the interstates and the motorways of Los Angeles is the way that it enables one to encounter almost cinematographically through the screen of the car itself, the city beyond it. So it's good architecture. The interstate is good architecture because it frames the architecture beyond it, or the reality beyond it, in a way. So I really like this idea, like, again, diffusing the boundaries of what architecture is.
Yeah, I mean, that, to just pick up on the motorway thing, if you were to ask me what was the most important image in Banham, it would be the intersection of the San Diego and Santa Monica freeways. I mean, no question about it. It would be that, and this experience that he describes of driving on it at 50 miles an hour, which is quite difficult to do given the traffic conditions these days. But driving this intersection, having this experience, which is bodily, physical, and aesthetic all at the same time, and like you say, it's framing the city, and the intersection is also this great piece of architecture in itself. It's a great piece of it's sculptural. It's got beautiful forms and all of that, and it's and the building is used by loads of people, so it's a kind of it's a popular cultural everyday phenomenon as well. So it has all of these different levels of stuff going on, and they're all in somehow reinforcing each other. It's no, I think that's an absolutely critical image, and also I suppose also it poses a question of architecture. So it says, here I am, I'm an architectural critic, historian, and I'm really making you look at this thing which doesn't really exist in the category of architecture. But I'm saying it's important. You should look at it.
It's funny that it doesn't it? Because didn't we recently have that big campaign to preserve, was it Preston multi-story car park? Yes,
there's Preston bus station. That's right.
Which is just like a section of a piece of motorway.
No, that's a building. No, I think that there's the Preston bypass, which was which was the first section of the M6, and I think there has been a campaign to preserve that in some way. I don't know. The bus station is a bus station,
but doesn't it have a multi-story car park above it? But all I'm trying to say is that we actually do embrace architecture, architecture that is simply for cars. And we say this is architecture, but as soon as you bring in this idea of motion, for example, it somehow becomes problematic. I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly we have started to think about this now, and there are all sorts of. I mean, as I've discovered later on, in fact, that there are groups who are extremely interested in preserving motorway intersections and junctions, and I mean, I think I may end up writing something about that at some point. So we have definitely moved into that territory, but it's at the time that Banham first writes about it, I mean, it's not mainstream. It's like sort of hidden in plain sight, and assumed by everybody, but it's not mainstream in terms of architectural discourse. So things have moved a bit in that direction, and yeah, I mean, certainly the way that brutalism got written up about a few years ago, I mean, that's embodied some of that stuff.
I don't want to take up much more of your time, but I'm interested in the book, the writing of the book itself. It's written in a very your encounter with it. I put some. It sort of ties architecture into an analytical method, so far as I can see, which intentionally blurs boundaries. So you're making a point of, so in a way, I suppose, dethroning the privileged position of architecture as the kind of preeminent art. Was that intentional? I mean, is that just how you encounter the world, or is that do you have a view to kind of make people think about architecture more holistically?
Well, no, I do have that. I mean, I think in that aspect of it, I think what I was doing was probably more, it was kind of sympathetic to Banham. I think all right the way through Banham's career, then he's asking questions about what architecture actually is, and where the limits of the category are, and who participates in it, and who's allowed to participate in it, and all of that sort of thing. And I was writing about Banham, but I was also very sympathetic to that position. So I suppose I have, fairly consistently, I would ask those kinds of questions.
But it's almost like it's almost like you encounter it like poetry or like literature. It's it's sort of as not only the buildings that he looks at, but his writing and his thinking itself, almost like something with semiotic functioning, a kind of symbol.
Yeah. Okay. No, I mean that's fair enough. I think. I mean, I did want to differentiate what I was doing a bit from the way that other people have written about Banham in the past. So for example, I mean, the Nigel Whiteley book, I mean, is an astonishing piece of research. I mean, he really did. It's a much larger book, but he is very caught up with Banham as somebody who is in the world of architecture. So it's very focused on those debates alone, and I thought that wasn't quite right. The as a figure, Banham is more interesting if you think about him as somebody with a pretty broad range of interest, and also somebody who's quite performative as well. So somebody who is a figure in the world, and that a big part of his activity and his brain is taken up with architecture, but it's not the only thing, and that the Banham universe is quite an expansive and capacious one. So I wanted to make that clear, and and also Banham as a figure. I felt that he was a pretty singular character, and a lot of what he was doing was creating what we might now call media presence. So he's pretty quick on the uptake, doing radio talks and TV and writing loads of journalism and putting himself out there like that. And there's something quite performative about it. So the dressing up is quite important. So different points in his career, or when he's making different arguments, he wears different clothes, and the clothes are sometimes quite polemical, and is polemical the right word? But sometimes the clothes are there to make a point.
Didactic clothing.
Didactic, yeah, that's the word.
I like the idea. I think I'm going to take that on. Isn't that what the black polo neck in the architecture world is, isn't it? It's a sort of...
Well, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. You know what? We all do it to go to a extent. But I mean, Banham sort of changed his appearance quite a bit over the years. And
he goes from a tweed suit and a pipe to a Superman T-shirt.
He does. He goes, yes, there's the Superman period, and then there's the kind of full Western cowboy thing, which is, is a very curious thing to do. So I know I was definitely interested in those things, and it just seemed that this stuff was worth talking about. If you just talk about what arguments he's having with the British architectural establishment, you're kind of missing some of the other things. I mean, what with on that. For me, a lot of the most interesting writing, it isn't done for architecture; it's done for New Society. So, New Society, I think, was a very good home for him. It was this left-leaning but non-aligned magazine, and open to stuff. It could accept. It was of the left, but it could accept that there might be interesting stuff going on in America. It wasn't going to just dismiss that. And it was interested in popular culture. So Banham was an extremely good fit there, and I think was pretty important to the magazine in the 60s and well right up to the mid 70s, I think. So I wanted to take that stuff seriously. That's
I think that's what I felt when I was reading it, and I've written loads of notes and underlined bits, and I don't like drawing on books as a principle, but I needed to. But it was that it kind of broke apart. Well, it creates more questions. It answers lots of questions. So, and without saying, your book has only created more questions. It answers a lot of questions, but it does it in a way that has allowed me, certainly, to start thinking about that. I'm very interested in postmodernity as a paradigm, as a moment, which may have come and gone. I don't know. And it certainly bridges that gap, and it makes sense of a lot of the kind of later forms of architecture, which do seem to me to become increasingly obsessed with a lot of the things that he's already discovering. And your book helps, I think, a great deal in that. It's a really elegant thing, and I guess it has the way that you approach it has its basis in the way that you've approached in some of your other books as well. I mean, the first time we came into contact with each other was in that literally amazing lecture you gave, which I still cite to people, on sex and buildings in the Mackintosh Lecture Theatre at the Glasgow School of Art, of happy memory, in which there was about 200 people in a 100 seat.
Yeah, there was. No.
And a great deal of aggression at the end, if I remember rightly, from students that were disappointed that there wasn't more about.
Yeah, no, gosh, no, I've sort of forgotten that. Well, thank you. That's very kind. I'm slightly terrified of that book now. That seems like that book belonged to a different moment. You couldn't really do it. Couldn't really do it in the same way now. No.
Was that a 2013?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, a lot has changed since then. A lot has changed.
Absolutely, yeah. No, you do. Yeah. So,
but there was in that building, in the way you talked about, in that book, and the way you talked about it, there was also this kind of, I mean, it was a very confessional lecture that you gave, but there was a kind of, or perhaps just candid lecture that you gave, and there was this sense that architecture could only meaningfully, certainly contemporary architecture, could only be meaningfully understood in relation to the motivations of the people around it. And that's kind of what I get out of your Banham book as well.
Yeah.
It's not trying to draw a line around this and say, this is architecture, and we describe it in these terms. And in a way, then, it seems, I can see why Banham remains an inspiration for you, because it's what you're doing too.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You have to talk about buildings in relation to how they're used and inhabited as much as they exist in a multimedia form. That they're designs, and then there are built objects, and then there's the use and inhabitation, and they're all it's all important to keep in play somehow.
Mm.
Banham, I just thought, I've consistently been interested in his work for that reason. That his understanding of architecture is capacious enough to incorporate all of those things at the same time, and to incorporate contradictions as well. We need sort of open to the fact that something might pose different questions in real life. I mean, plenty of other people do that, but he's very acute at doing it, and the way that he describes experience, the experience of buildings, is really still good. I think it's but rich. That's what I would say.
Yeah, rich, and I think you get that as well. There's the book is filled with lovely descriptions by you yourself as well. Thank you ever so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and thanks ever so much for the book as well.
Yeah, well, thank you. No, it's lovely to talk about it, and I'm glad you got something out of it. So, no, thank you.
So there you have it. Thanks again to Richard Williams. Check out his book, which you can find online in bookshops and via the link in the description. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, whatever it is, A is for Architecture, for more conversations with interesting people about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space. Cheers.